The precinct was unusually quiet that afternoon. Detective Elijah Carter, a respected investigator with a spotless record, walked through the bustling hall with his usual calm demeanor. His presence commanded respect, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it. Tall, sharp-eyed, and undeniably charismatic, Elijah had solved cases others wouldn't dare touch. But that day, he wasn't here for a case. He was here to conduct a routine internal review, nothing out of the ordinary for him. As he entered the main briefing room, conversations hushed, and a few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Elijah didn't need to guess why. He had spent years navigating unspoken tensions in places like this. To some, he was a trailblazer, a symbol of progress in a system that resisted change. To others, he was an unwelcome reminder that times were changing faster than they were ready to accept. At the back of the room stood Officer Bradley Reese, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and a scowl plastered on his face. Reese was a veteran of the force, known for his quick temper and outdated views. To him, Elijah wasn't just a colleague, it was an affront to everything Reese thought the department should stand for. As far as Reese was concerned, Elijah hadn't earned his position. He was convinced Elijah's success was the product of political correctness rather than genuine ability, though anyone who'd worked with Elijah knew otherwise. Elijah began his presentation, his voice steady and authoritative, as he detailed the importance of accountability and integrity in law enforcement. His words were direct but respectful, aimed at fostering unity rather than division. But Reese wasn't listening. He stood at the back, arms still crossed, seething quietly. Every word from Elijah felt like an attack, a challenge to his authority and worldview. When the briefing concluded, Elijah stayed behind to answer questions. A few officers approached him, engaging in polite conversation, while Reese lingered near the doorway, his jaw clenched. Elijah noticed but paid him no mind. He had dealt with men like Reese before. Eventually, the room emptied out, leaving just Elijah and Reese. The silence was thick with tension. Reese stepped forward, his boots echoing against the tile floor. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" Reese's voice was low but charged with hostility. Elijah turned to face him, his expression calm but guarded. "I don't think I'm better than anyone, Officer Reese. I'm just here to do my job." "Your job," Reese spat, stepping closer. "Your job is to waltz in here and tell us how to do ours. You've never been out there, not like us. You wouldn't last a day on the streets." Elijah met his glare with unwavering composure. "I've been on the streets, Reese. I've faced the same dangers, walked the same beat. The difference is, I don't let fear dictate my actions." That last line struck a nerve. Reese's face darkened, and before either man could think twice, Reese's fist shot out, striking Elijah squarely in the jaw. The sound echoed through the empty room. Elijah stumbled but didn't fall, his hand instinctively going to his face. For a moment, there was only silence. Reese seemed to realize what he'd done, his face shifting from anger to shock. Elijah straightened, his eyes locking onto Reese's. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," Elijah said quietly, his voice steady despite the sting in his jaw. Reese opened his mouth to respond, but the door swung open, and a young officer stepped inside, his eyes widening at the scene. "What's going on in here?" Elijah didn't answer. He simply grabbed his briefcase and walked out, leaving Reese standing there, frozen in place. The room felt colder, heavier, as if the consequences of Reese's actions had already begun to settle in. Outside, Elijah's mind raced. He wasn't angry, at least, not in the way Reese might have expected. He was disappointed, not just in Reese, but in the culture that allowed men like him to thrive. As he stepped into the parking lot, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "Chief, we have a problem," he said. But even as he spoke, Elijah knew this was more than just a problem. It was the beginning of something much bigger, a confrontation that would force everyone involved to face truths they'd long ignored. Elijah sat in his car, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. The faint throb in his jaw served as a stark reminder of what had just happened. He wasn't surprised, not entirely. Men like Reese had always been a part of the system, clinging to outdated beliefs and resisting the idea that change could be a good thing. But this, striking another officer, especially someone in Elijah's position, was reckless even for Reese. He glanced at his phone, still in his hand after the call to the chief. The response had been measured, but Elijah could sense the hesitation on the other end. "Let me handle it," the chief had said, his tone more cautious than decisive. Elijah didn't miss the subtle undertone. "Don't make this a bigger deal than it needs to be." But it was a big deal. It wasn't just about him. It was about what Reese represented, about the culture that allowed someone like him to feel untouchable. Elijah had seen it too many times, officers hiding behind their badges, using power as a shield against accountability. He was determined not to let this incident get swept under the rug, even if it meant ruffling some feathers. As he sat there, his thoughts drifted back to how it all began. Elijah hadn't set out to be a trailblazer or a symbol of anything. He just wanted to do good in the world, to help people. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, he'd seen firsthand what it was like to feel invisible, to feel like no one cared. He'd watched his mother work 3 jobs to keep food on the table, never complaining, but always exhausted. And he'd seen his father, a man with a good heart, but a short temper, struggle to keep his head above water in a system that seemed designed to hold him back. Elijah had vowed to be different, to make a difference. Joining law enforcement wasn't an easy choice, but it felt like the right one. He wanted to be the kind of officer who treated people with dignity and respect, the kind who could look someone in the eye and say, "I see you. I'm here to help." But the reality of the job wasn't always so noble. From the very beginning, he'd faced resistance, subtle and overt. There were the snide comments, the whispers behind his back, the accusations that he'd only made detective because the department wanted to check a diversity box. He'd ignored it, focusing instead on doing his job and doing it well. And he had. Over the years, Elijah had built a reputation as one of the best. His solve rate was unmatched, and his ability to connect with people, victims, witnesses, even suspects, set him apart. But no matter how much he proved himself, there were always people like Reese ready to tear him down. The sound of a police siren in the distance pulled Elijah from his thoughts. He started the car, the engine's hum grounding him as he navigated the streets back to his office. He needed to prepare his report, to document everything that had happened. It wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about ensuring that Reese faced the consequences of his actions. By the time Elijah reached the station, the tension in his shoulders had eased, slightly replaced by a steady resolve. He walked through the front doors, his presence once again drawing attention. A few officers glanced his way, their expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. News traveled fast in the precinct, and Elijah knew it was only a matter of time before everyone knew about the incident. As he made his way to his desk, he spotted Officer Karen Mills, one of the few people on the force he genuinely trusted. She was sharp, dependable, and one of the few who treated him as an equal from day one. Karen raised an eyebrow as he approached, her keen eyes scanning his face. "What happened to your jaw?" she asked, her voice low but concerned. Elijah hesitated for a moment before answering. "Reese happened." Karen's eyes widened, a mix of shock and anger flashing across her face. "You're kidding. He get you?" Elijah nodded, pulling out his chair and sitting down. "I'm filing a report. The chief knows, but you know how these things go." Karen leaned in closer, lowering her voice even further. "Elijah, you need to be careful. Reese has friends in high places. If this turns into a he said, they'll protect him." "I know," Elijah said, his tone calm but firm. "That's why I'm making sure there's no room for doubt. This isn't just about me, Karen. It's about accountability. If we let this slide, what does that say about us?" Karen didn't respond immediately. She leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "You're right," she said finally, "but you're walking a tightrope here. Just watch your back, okay?" Elijah gave her a small nod, appreciating her concern but unwilling to let fear dictate his actions. He opened his laptop and began typing his report, detailing the events with precision and clarity. Every word was deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation or dismissal. As he worked, the station buzzed around him. Officers coming and going, paperwork shuffling, phones ringing. But Elijah was focused, tuning out the noise as he laid the foundation for what he knew would be a battle. Hours passed, and by the time he finished, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the precinct. Elijah leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as fatigue settled in, but there was no time to rest. He needed to prepare for what came next. The door to the captain's office opened, and Chief Daniels stepped out, his expression unreadable as he scanned the room. His eyes landed on Elijah, and he motioned for him to come over. Elijah stood, smoothing his tie as he made his way to the chief. Daniels was a seasoned officer, respected by most, but not without his own flaws. He prided himself on maintaining order, sometimes at the expense of justice. Elijah, Daniels began, his tone measured. I've read your preliminary report. It's thorough. It's the truth, Elijah replied evenly. Daniels nodded slowly. I'm not questioning that. But you know how this is going to look. Reese has been on the force for over 20 years. He's got connections, and this department has a reputation to uphold. Elijah's jaw tightened. So what are you saying, Chief? That we should just let this go. I'm saying we need to be smart about this, Daniels said, his voice low. You've got a spotless record, Elijah. Don't let this turn into a spectacle that ends up hurting both of you. Elijah stared at him, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. With all due respect, Chief, this isn't about me or Reese. It's about what's right. And if we can't stand for that, then what's the point of any of this? Daniels sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. I'll take it under advisement. In the meantime, keep your head down and let me handle it. As Elijah left the office, his resolve only grew stronger. He knew what he was up against, a system designed to protect its own, even at the expense of justice. But he also knew that change didn't come without a fight. And Elijah was ready to fight. The days that followed felt like a slow burn, each one adding to the tension in the precinct. Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching him now, not just his colleagues, but the whole department. Whispers followed him wherever he went, the air charged with uncertainty. Some officers offered him thinly veiled sympathy, others shot him looks of contempt. But none of them said anything outright. Reese had his supporters, and it was clear that Elijah wasn't as welcome in the fold as he once was. Each morning, Elijah would walk into the station, greeted by the same cold stares and hushed conversations. The atmosphere had shifted, a subtle but undeniable change that gnawed at him. It wasn't just Reese he had to worry about anymore. It was the entire force. The longer this dragged on, the more it seemed like the line between right and wrong blurred. How far would they go to protect one of their own? His phone buzzed on his desk, breaking his thoughts. It was a text from Karen. Have you heard? Reese is pushing back. The union's involved now. They're saying you provoked him. Elijah's stomach turned. He knew Reese wouldn't go down without a fight. Involving the union was a new level of escalation. They were a powerful force in the precinct, and their support could turn the tide in Reese's favor. Elijah stared at the message for a long moment before typing a response. I haven't provoked anyone. This is about accountability. It's about doing what's right. He hit send, then leaned back in his chair, trying to steady his racing thoughts. The truth didn't seem to matter here. The narrative was already shifting, and with each passing hour, it seemed like the story was being rewritten. Reese was playing the victim now, painting himself as the one who had been unfairly attacked. And with the union backing him, it would be hard to convince anyone that Elijah wasn't the aggressor. As Elijah sat there, his mind raced through every angle of the situation. There were options. He could go public, make a bigger scene, force the department's hand. But he knew that would only escalate things further. And despite everything, he didn't want this to turn into a spectacle. He just wanted justice, for the truth to come out. But the longer the silence stretched, the more uncertain that outcome seemed. Later that afternoon, Elijah found himself in an unexpected situation when he was called to a meeting with Sergeant Davis. Davis was a no-nonsense officer, known for his fair but firm approach to leadership. He wasn't one to pick sides, but Elijah could tell from the look on his face that he wasn't here to offer any support. "Elijah, I've been following the situation. It's a mess, and you know it?" Davis began, his voice low but direct. "Reese may have crossed a line, but you don't need me to tell you that this is getting out of hand. You're making this personal. You need to step back, let things cool down." Elijah didn't flinch at the words. "I'm not making it personal, Sergeant. This is about what happened. Reese hit me, and now he's lying about it. The truth matters." Davis sighed and leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. "I get it, Elijah, but you've got to be smart. You know how this works. The department isn't going to back you on this unless you play by their rules. If you dig your heels in, it'll be you who gets burned, not Reese." Elijah's grip on the back of his chair tightened. "So what? I let him get away with it. I let him walk all over me, walk all over the truth." "No," Davis replied, his voice softening a little. "But you need to understand the bigger picture. Reese might be a problem, but you're not going to fix it by fighting a battle you can't win. Sometimes the best way to win is to let someone else take the heat for a while." Elijah stared at him, but there was no comfort in the words. The truth was, Davis was right in some ways. The department was a machine, and in a place like this, it was easy to get chewed up and spit out. But Elijah wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. "I hear you, Sergeant," Elijah said, his voice measured, "but I'm not backing down." Sergeant Davis didn't respond immediately. He looked at Elijah, as though weighing the decision to offer advice or give up on him entirely. Finally, he gave a short nod. "Just be careful, Elijah. You're walking on thin ice." Elijah left the meeting with a heavy heart, knowing that the road ahead would only get harder. His conversations with Karen had turned into long, late-night phone calls filled with frustration and worry. Every day, it seemed like Reese was gaining ground, his supporters rallying around him. And even though Karen tried to reassure him, Elijah could tell she was growing concerned too. A week passed before Elijah received another bombshell. His phone rang early one morning, the number on the screen unfamiliar. "Detective Carter," a voice on the other end asked. "We need to talk." Elijah's pulse quickened. "Who is this?" "I'm with Internal Affairs. We've been looking into some complaints about Officer Reese. We need your side of the story." Elijah's grip tightened on the phone. Internal Affairs. This was unexpected. But as the conversation progressed, Elijah realized this was no ordinary investigation. The complaints were serious, allegations of misconduct, corruption, and abuse of power. Reese wasn't just being investigated for hitting Elijah, the scope of the inquiry was much wider. As much as Elijah wanted to feel relief, a nagging suspicion gnawed at him. This wasn't a simple case of one officer's misconduct. Something bigger was at play here. The investigation into Reese wasn't just about his actions toward Elijah. It was about the crumbling structure of the entire department. Elijah had stumbled onto something much darker than he had anticipated, and now he was part of it. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Reese wasn't just a rogue officer. He was part of a larger network, an old guard that had held power for far too long. A system that was built on corruption, favoritism, and science. Elijah was a threat to that system, and Reese was just the beginning. But even as he prepared to give his statement to Internal Affairs, Elijah knew the danger was far from over. Reese wasn't going to go down without a fight. And as the investigation into Reese's actions began to escalate, Elijah found himself at the center of a storm that threatened to consume everything he had worked for. The truth was out there, but getting to it might cost him more than he was willing to lose.